Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I know I haven't exactly been super timely on getting these up, but today I wanted to do the final part of my almost a year's worth wrap up. Of course it's taken me so long to do this that now I'm gonna have to do another big wrap up that's like for over the summer, but that's future Kate's problem. So in my previous ones, I did one that was all the young adult speculative fiction, so sci-fi fantasy. I did one that was young adult contemporary and also all the nonfiction. And so then today I'm going to be doing all of the adult literature that I've read in that 10-month span. So I'm going to subdivide this into speculative fiction, so again sci-fi and fantasy, romance and historical, and then what I'm calling classics. So I'm going to start off with the speculative fiction. The first of these is Tremontaine Season 1. This is by a bunch of different authors. They all contribute like a chapter essentially, and it's edited by Ellen Kushner. This is a prequel to the Swords Point series, which I have read. I read it first, I think, in high school, but I've read it multiple times since then. I really love it. It's basically like a fantasy world, but there's no real magic. It's just like an invented world where there are swordsmen who basically are hired to fight duels of honor for the nobles. There's only 3 books in the main series, and those, I think the first one was published in the 80s and the last one was published in the early mid 2000s. They are very, very queer friendly. There's not a ton of people of color in them though, if any. So in the Tremontaine Season 1, which is the prequel series, and now there's Season 2 and Season 3, it is, again, very queer friendly, but also they've added a lot of people of color, which I really appreciate. Because this is done by a lot of different authors, it's basically a serialized story where each new chapter has a different author. The quality varies between the chapters. There was definitely one chapter where I was like, oh my god, you've got to be kidding me. The style that the author had chosen just read as super heavy-handed, and I really didn't like it. But then it's usually generally pretty high quality. There were just a couple that the styles didn't match what I was looking for. But then there were some that were really great, and they do all form a continuous narrative, although there are people that focus on different main characters. It's sort of an ensemble cast. So I read this one, I think back in July of last year. So I don't remember a ton about it, but it was really, really fun. It had a great queer women relationship that I was really into, and I definitely do want to keep reading it. Because it's so serialized, I think Season 2 maybe only just recently came out, so I'm gonna be looking for that. So the next one is Fellside by M.R. Carey. This is the same guy who did Girl with All the Gifts. I've got to be honest, I really loved Girl with All the Gifts, but this one just didn't do it for me. It's about a girl who gets sent to prison for supposedly burning down her apartment and killing a child in the apartment below her. And she also has the ability to see ghosts, and she's had this her whole life. And basically while she's in the prison, there's a ghost of a previous inmate who starts communicating with her. And, her case starts to go on, and it turns out that, maybe she didn't actually commit this. So 90% of the book I enjoyed, I was on board. It wasn't quite as good for me as Girl with All the Gifts. It was still holding my interest, it was still engaging. And then the ending happened. And the ending was just such bullshit that I lost my taste for the entire book. And obviously I'm not going to spoil it, but it just felt completely cheap. It felt like it just ruined the book for me. So I think M.R. Carey is a really imaginative writer, but I think that his first book is so far the only one that I've really liked. So the next one is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This completes the Broken Earth trilogy, which begins with the 5th season, which I've talked about before. I love this series. I've pretty much loved every series that N.K. Jemisin writes. She deals so much with these intricate worlds. I love her world building. I love her magic systems. I love her characters. She deals with systems of power and oppression because she's an African American woman, but she deals with them in these really nuanced and intricate and, sometimes devastating ways. I can't say anything about the plot of this one, but it's just so good. And I've seen some people starting to read the 5th season, and I'm really excited about that. I think that this series has kind of flown under the radar, and I really want everyone to read it because it's just amazing. So next up, I have 2 that I'm going to talk about kind of back to back, which is Magic Burns and Magic Bites. Sorry, reverse those. Magic Bites is the first one, Magic Burns is the second one. These are by Ilona Andrews, which are actually a husband and wife team. That's their pen name of their sort of co-writing endeavors. This is a fun urban fantasy series. So far, it hasn't really done anything very deep or surprising. It has a sort of, tough, kick-ass female as the main character, and She works as basically like a mercenary slash PI type person. I have heard that the series gets better as it goes on. I think that it has fun in the first couple books and it definitely shows promise, but there are a lot of weaknesses in it so far. Like, there's this whole pack of shapeshifters and they're just so caught up in their own masculinity that it's just so frustrating. She has this like flirtation kind of with the like leader of the shapeshifters, but it just reads really badly, frankly, because they're both sort of pretending that they're not into each other and they're just like trying to get into fights all the time. And, you know, he's a man, so he has to prove that he can beat her and, you know, anyway. I've heard once they get together, it actually ends up getting a lot better because they're actually like nice to each other. They admit that they like each other and all that kind of stuff. So I probably will continue the series. It hasn't really been a priority for me because I wasn't like hugely thrilled about the first two, but it is still a fun series. And the world that she's created is really interesting in that basically magic started rising and then tech started dying. So when magic is in force, tech doesn't work, and then when the magic dies, tech comes back and magic doesn't work. And this can happen like multiple times a day. It can fluctuate. So the world is cool, the magic is cool. I'm just hoping that she gets better at like the interpersonal relationships. Okay, so next up is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. This one was made into a movie with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, which I think most people are more familiar with the movie than with the book. I saw the movie for the first time a few years ago and I really liked it. I thought it was funny though because it's clearly billed as a romantic comedy, but it's a very dark romantic comedy. And reading the original source material, I can definitely see why, because actually the book is even darker. So the basic plot of the book generally follows the plot of the movie, so I'm not really gonna recap it, but the emotions in it run a lot darker. It really goes a lot more into the abusive relationship that Nicole Kidman's character is in. I forget all of their names. And there's just a lot of like really obsessive and unhealthy emotions in it. So yeah, this book was really interesting. I think if you've watched the movie and enjoyed it, then it's definitely worth checking out. There's also apparently a prequel series that's about like the aunts that are taking care of the sisters, and that might be fun to read also, although I haven't read it. Okay, so the next up is actually another two-parter. It is Valor and Vanity and Of Noble Family. These are both by Mary Robinette Kowal. These are the fourth and fifth books of the Glamorist Histories, so book 5 finishes off the series. These are often billed as like Jane Austen but with magic, and the first book is very much that. It's pretty much Pride and Prejudice just with added magic, the magic being glamour, which is essentially like another art form that privileged women learn along with, you know, playing the piano and embroidery and all that kind of stuff. And they basically like pull threads out of what's called the ether to craft illusions. Oh my goodness! However, after the first book, each book becomes like a mini subgenre. So the second book is like military spy, the third book is like social revolution, and the fourth book is like heist, basically, where glamorous married couple Jane and Vincent are traveling and end up getting attacked by pirates, and then they end up like concocting this scheme to get all of their stuff back. I'm not entirely sure which subcategory to call Of Noble Family, the fifth one, but basically Vincent gets word that his father has died on the estate that's in, I forget exactly where. So the estate is in Antigua, and they travel there basically to settle up affairs of the estate because Vincent's older brother, who's actually inheriting everything, is like injured and can't go. I have done most of these on audiobook. They're a lot of fun. Mary Robinette Kowal does the reading herself, except in book 5 where she is joined by 2 other voice actors. Basically Robin Mills, who also does all of N.K. Jemisin's books. She's an African-American woman, and a man that I had never heard of before, but he is also black. And the reason for that is because there are a lot of black characters in the narrative, including Caribbean people and people of, you know, mixed backgrounds, and, you know, they got people who actually know how to do those voices for that part. While I understand the theory of hiring 2 other voice actors, unfortunately there are a lot of technical difficulties with it. For one, the male narrator speaks very slowly. It gets better throughout the audiobook, but it starts out real bad. And then the other one is that Robin Mills, for some reason, her voice is like turned way down. Like the volume is super low. So I had to be like constantly adjusting the volume on the audiobook, which was a little frustrating. But besides those technical difficulties, I think that the audiobook works great. One of my sort of worries going into Of Noble Family was that it was going to turn into like a white savior narrative where like Jane and Vincent sweep in and just solve everyone's problems just by, you know, being white and better than everyone else. It does not happen like this. There are a few elements of the story that kind of superficially look like that, but it's very much just Jane and Vincent actually listening to the people that are enslaved and using the fact that they are white and of a higher class to step in when they are asked to and when it is needed. All of the black characters are drawn really intricately and they're very nuanced. They're actual full realized characters, and it's such an interesting story. I think that this is definitely my favorite of the series. I'm a little sad that this wrapped up the series because Jane and Vincent are one of my absolute favorite literary couples. They're just so loving and communicative, and they form such a great partnership that I would happily continue reading more of them if she ever decides to write them, but I think that it is a great series and it ends on a good note. Okay, so one of the last ones in the speculative fiction section is Ancillary Mercy. This is the third book in the Imperial Rocked trilogy. The first one was Ancillary Justice, and then Ancillary Sword. This is a science fiction story where the main character is an AI that used to be the AI of a battleship. And the way that the AI system works in this world is that basically there's the core that is inside the ship, and then there are human bodies that have basically been implanted with the same consciousness as the main core. So the main core is essentially like a many-bodied AI that can see and process many different viewpoints simultaneously. However, when the story begins, the main character has been separated from her ship and all her other ancillaries, and so she is just like one remaining body. And then basically she ends up bringing about revolution. This series does so much with like expressions of gender, because in the culture that the ancillary comes from, there are no differentiations between gender, and when she meets other people and is speaking in a language that actually does have gender pronouns, she defaults to she. It's really interesting the way that her consciousness works and the way that all of her just different perceptions work. There is another book that takes place in the same world, but it's like a separate standalone, and it's called Provenance, and I am really excited to be reading this one because I think that Ann Leckie just writes amazing science fiction that deals with gender and personhood and social justice in really interesting ways, but it also has some great world building. So next up, and finally for the adult lit speculative section, is Changeling by Victor LaValle. This is one that I got recommended to me when I was searching for books to read for Black History Month. I ended up running out of time and I didn't get this one done during February, but I picked it up later. It is so weird. The pacing is really strange in this novel. So it starts with the history of the main character's parents, like how they met, how they fell in love, and then it like skips ahead to the main character's childhood, and then his like young adulthood, and then his like married life, and then like it finally gets around to him and his wife and their new baby, which is what apparently, according to the synopsis on the back of the book, is actually the point of the book. This stuff with his parents is left unresolved for a lot of the book because his father disappeared when he was very young. It's sort of built up as this big mystery that I feel like doesn't really pay off by the end. And also, based on the blurb of this book, I knew of something that was going to happen about halfway through the book, and so I spent that entire period leading up to it just waiting for that to happen. Which essentially, like, him and his wife are having this new baby, you know, they're exhausted, they're running on fumes, and the wife starts getting these like pictures and messages from an unknown source that then are deleted as soon as she opens them. So she has no proof that this is coming to her. And then, in the words of the blurb, she does the unthinkable, and the main character is like cast into this world of doubt. To me, does the unthinkable was pretty obvious as to what that was gonna be. So this one is technically an urban fantasy. The fantasy elements stay very peripheral for most of the book. It's mostly about this main character growing up. I think his name is Brian, but I might be wrong about that. And then, you know, him dealing with his grief after this unthinkable act. And then, like, 80% of the way through the book, it just goes completely off the rails. So yeah, I don't know how exactly I feel about this book. I thought that there were a lot of really interesting things in it, but it was so weird that I think I need to read something else by Victor LaValle before I can really decide how I feel about him as a writer. But I don't think I'll be reading this particular book again. Okay, so moving on to romance and historical. The first of these is Girl Waits with Gun by Amy Stewart. This is a historical novel, you might be able to guess from the cover, and it is actually based on a real person, which is one of the very first female law enforcement officers. So this is about a woman named Constance Kopp. Yes, really, it's spelled K-O-P-P, but yes, really, it's pronounced Kopp, and her two sisters, and they are basically living on a farm by themselves. They end up sort of getting on the wrong side of like a local corrupt tycoon, and they end up sort of having to take matters into their own hands. It's sort of a mystery novel, except that like there's not really a mystery, we know who did it, but there are some other like mystery elements to it in like side stories. But it is set in like the early 1910s, so it says 1914 is when it began, and I really love that it's based off a real person. They have a picture of the real Constance Kopp in the back of the book, and there are like real newspaper articles that they've pulled about what was going on. And there are, I think, 2 sequels so far. I own the second one, haven't read it yet, but I'm definitely gonna keep going because it's a really fun series and I love that it's based off of a real person. Okay, so next up is another like 2-parter. I read 2 romance novels by Courtney Milan. They are The Countess Conspiracy and Suffragette Scandal. These are books, I think, 3 and 4 of the Brothers Sinister series, which I've read the previous ones of hers and I've really enjoyed them. Courtney Milan writes really fun, engaging historical romance that doesn't totally whitewash history and, you know, actually acknowledges the social injustices, but also still manages to make really compelling, fun stories. Countess Conspiracy features a character that we've seen come up many times before. She's basically a female scientist that has been using her male friend as like her cover for her scientific theories. Like, it's been published under his name and he gives talks as if it's his discoveries because it's like the 1800s. And then Suffragette Scandal is kind of as it sounds, about a lady suffragette and a man who, I read this one a little while ago, so I'm forgetting the details, but I think he was a soldier and is like dealing with some PTSD, but he ends up like helping out her when their press starts getting attacked because they basically run a newspaper that advocates for women's suffrage. And I would basically, if you like historical romance, I would definitely recommend Courtney Milan. Her books are really snappy, the character dynamics are really great. I feel like the chemistry is always really strong between the main couples, and she doesn't fall into a lot of those super toxic tropes that a lot of het romances do. So I know this is long, but we're gonna move on to classics. We're almost done. So the first of these is The Wizard of Oz, followed by The Marvelous Land of Oz. I did both of these on audiobook. Wizard of Oz was actually narrated by Anne Hathaway, which was actually really fun. She's actually a really good narrator. I had read both of these before, but it had been many, many years since I had done them, and it's just really fun to go back and visit them. I think Wizard of Oz is a really fun series. It's so imaginative. You know, since these were originally published in like the early 1900s, there's a lot of his social commentary I don't totally agree with, but it's also really fun that like almost all of his main characters are women, and they often tend to be a lot more competent than the men. And the world just has some of my favorite characters ever. Like, no one is ever gonna beat The Glass Cat. So the next one is Alice in Wonderland. I also did this one on Audible. I think this one was narrated by Scarlett Johansson. I didn't love this one. I think I had maybe read Alice in Wonderland before, many, many years ago. But yeah, honestly, I was just not a huge fan. I feel like with Wizard of Oz, a lot of the characters are silly in a way that's actually funny, whereas in Alice in Wonderland they were silly and ridiculous in ways that just felt grating and kind of annoying. So yeah, this is one with several sequels that I don't think I'll be reading because I just don't think Lewis Carroll really works for me. Okay, so next is End of the Affair by Graham Greene. The audiobook of this one is narrated by Colin Firth, so if you're gonna do it on audiobook. I'm not really sure how I feel about this one. I didn't love it. It's about a man who, before the book starts, was carrying on an affair, and then she ends up calling it off, and then later on she dies. Like, she stays with her husband, he ends up running into the husband like years after the affair is ended, and he spends a lot of time feeling like he hates Sarah, the woman he was having an affair with, and that he hates her husband because, you know, he considers him to just be a fool. You know, his feelings kind of develop over the course of the narrative. I thought it was an interesting emotional look at this man and into like an unhappy marriage and adultery, but I don't really feel like I ever need to read it again. If I'm remembering correctly, it got weirdly religious at the end. Like, he ends up like blaming God for everything. And anyway, next up is one that I'm more excited about. This is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I love Shirley Jackson. She writes these just completely batshit gothics. The other one I've read is We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This one is about a group of people who have all been called by this professor to stay in this house that has this horrible history. So many people have died on the property. It's got such a reputation as being super haunted, and basically they're gonna live in the house and try to like document and prove whether or not there is a ghost, right? And you know, what could possibly go wrong? One thing I've noticed about Shirley Jackson's books is the way that she's really, really detailed and obsessive about food. And I'm not totally sure what the point of that even is. I just have noticed it both in We Have Always Lived in the Castle and in Haunting of Hill House. The meals are super detailed of what they eat. Like, the characters are really preoccupied with like when they're gonna eat next and what they're gonna eat. And honestly, it makes me really hungry while reading these books. And another thing that Shirley Jackson does really well is just like that slow, creeping dread, and it's so good. So the last book of this video, which is the last book of this wrap-up, which is now gonna have to be followed by the wrap-up of all the books I've read since I started doing this wrap-up, is Right Ho Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. This was actually like the first collection of short stories that he ever wrote for them, and you can kind of tell. Also, only like the first half of the collection is actually Jeeves stories, and then it goes into a couple stories of another character that he just wrote a few like one-offs to and then never really returned to. I think it was sort of the prototype for the Smith series, but anyway, I love P.G. Wodehouse. The stories all kind of sound the same if you describe the plot of them, so it can sometimes be difficult to remember which ones I've read and which ones I haven't, but honestly, that's not even the point. The point is that they're just so delightful, they're really funny, they're really warm, they're really comforting, and they're really satirical, but never really in a mean way, and they're just fantastic. So if you're ever in the mood to read something that is just light and funny and short and uplifting, check out P.G. Wodehouse's short story collection. The novels are also great, but if you are looking for something really fast and easy to digest, check out the short stories. That's where it's at. Okay, so that is going to be it for today's wrap-up. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you've been reading recently, what you've been enjoying down in the comments, and I'll see you guys very soon with another video. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye!